Tonight's speaker will be a familiar face to many of you. Matt Joost has been the Ottawa chapter secretary and treasurer for as long as I've been involved in the chapter. He's presented on CANRAF and Bomber Command, resupply operations of the Joint Arctic Weather Stations in Canada's High Arctic, Operation Mana, and Robert Archibald Logan. Matt retired from the Canadian Forces this past year. His final posting was with the Department of History and Heritage. He is currently working on a book about Canada's first all-black unit, Number 2 Construction Battalion. Please join me in welcoming Matt Joost.
Thank you very much. So tonight's little presentation came out of some other work that I was doing, and I stumbled upon it by accident, and it just grew and grew and grew. So there's something to be said sometimes for chasing down rabbit holes. The only problem is I can't remember what it was that I was originally looking for. So, all right then. So when we consider the realm of Chinese-Canadian aviators in the 1920s and 30s, there's a few names that come to mind for those that have some knowledge of Canadian aviation history. So, I mean, there's the CAHS School in Saskatoon, the Ma brothers who were bush pilots after the Second World War, and the Wong brothers who operated Central Airways out of Toronto's Island Airport. Now, what's commonly known as the CAHS School trained pilots to serve in the Chinese Air Force. Actually, it was the Canton Air Force, but we'll get to that in a few minutes. And there's the Mas who flew against the Japanese by flying supplies over the Himalayas. So there is a wartime connection in some of this. As I was saying, there's more to the topic than this brief list of names that I just read off, or that they served in combat or in wartime. In fact, during the interwar period, I would suggest that Chinese Canadians actually embraced aviation. Their participation was a lot larger than we've been given to understand. Given the small population of young Chinese males in Canada, a large number actually became pilots in the interwar period. Now, I propose to provide an overview tonight of some of these Chinese Canadians, why they undertook pilot training. I won't be going into depth on any individual organization, as this is simply an overview to introduce you to the topic of the Chinese Canadian experience in aviation in the interwar period. Now, word on the research. When you're looking at documents from the 1920s and 30s, the spelling of a Chinese name can vary considerably, especially in comparison to today's standard. This makes it difficult to track down an individual because they could be mentioned in newspapers under several different spellings or even just initials. Now, my research has also been limited to what's available on newspapers that you don't have to pay a ton of money for. So I've been restricted by not having Toronto or the Maritime Provinces included. Now, that could possibly provide further names, and I'm sure that there are. Furthermore, the Canadian censuses prior to 1921 often omitted the Chinese who were living in an area. And the names of those that I have found only appear in the newspapers with respect to aviation. So this means that we don't have very much background on a lot of these individuals. And at the start, I apologize in advance for the quality of many of the photographs. Trying to find photographs on these people is onerous. So most of these were taken from the newspaper articles. And as you know, this does not always produce the best of results. Now, a little background first. The Chinese first began to arrive in Canada around 1885 with the construction of the Transcontinental Railway of the Canadian Pacific. More started to arrive, and there was a big backlash against them from white residents of British Columbia. One of their fears was that they would increase in number, and BC will become an Asian province. A head tax was instituted in 1885 at $10. It was raised to $500 in 1903, or the equivalent of roughly 2 years' salary for the average Chinese worker in Canada at the time. The head tax was finally eliminated in 1923. Now, there were other issues with respect to racism. BC barred the Chinese from many professions such as lawyers and doctors. They didn't have the right to vote. And although a few were given franchise after the First World War, it was only because of their wartime service. The Chinese in Canada were not restricted to British Columbia. By 1921, there were most large Canadian cities had a Chinese community. They were often forced to live in these enclaves or Chinatowns as they became known, and they could also be found in many of the smaller communities. So roughly 40% of the Chinese Canadian community was 40% was outside of British Columbia. Now, besides the racism they experienced, the newspapers you'll see often refer to them as if they were not Canadian, even the ones who were born here. So it's no wonder that as we go through the names and what these people wanted to do, it's no wonder that some of them felt isolated and turned their gaze towards China. Now, we have to look at what was happening there in order to understand what was happening here. So the Qian dynasty was overthrown in October 1911. Sun Yat-sen was the first leader of the Chinese Republic from January to the 10th of March 1912. He quickly turned over power, but by 1915, the country had disintegrated into areas ruled by many warlords. And in 1919, he resurrected the Kuomintang, or Chinese National League or Party, also sometimes called the China National League or Party, in an effort to militarily reunite the country. Now, Sun died in 1925, and in 1926, Chiang Kai-shek took over control of the KMT, and he continued Sun's efforts at reunifying China, but also his own efforts to rid the country of the communists. Now, there was military aviation in China during the First World War. So the original Chinese Air Force was formed in January 1915 and bought British and French fighters. They even had their own indigenous designed and built aircraft, the Nanyun gun bus, which is shown here. It was used operationally to suppress some of the belligerent warlords. Throughout the war, the Air Force remained quite small. Now, just out of interest, there was a Chinese pilot who flew in combat in the West. And this was Etienne-Su or Yu Bin-hu. And I hope I get their names pronounced properly. He learned to fly while studying in France. And he was originally a member of the French Foreign Legion in 1914. He soon became a member of the French Air Force. Is credited with shooting down 2 aircraft and 1 balloon, and forcing down 2 other aircrafts, and 4 probable. So by British standards, he was an ace. And he returned to China in 1919. Now, during the Civil War, there were at least 16 different air forces up to 1937 supporting the various warlords or regional governments. The generals were not unaware of what aircraft could do. Some of these air forces were quite small and could only afford a dozen or so aircraft. However, some were much larger, like the Canton Air Force that supported Chiang Kai-shek. Many of the smaller forces only lasted a few years, some in the early 20s, another in the early 1930s. And of these 16, some were allied with Chiang at one time or another. Now, in 1937, the disputes were put aside with the Japanese invasion of China, and even the dispute with the Chinese Communist Party. All of their efforts were now directed at the Japanese, and the new Chinese Air Force was created. China was not isolated from world events in the world of aviation. The presence of Westerners in the country helped bring about air-mindedness. In 1921, the Chinese government announced it would develop its own airline and soon had a Beijing-Shanghai service flying. In April 1929, the Nanking government of Chiang Kai-shek formed the China National Aviation Corporation, the CNAC. American help was sought in running the airline. It was soon operating 3 airmail routes centered on Beijing and Nanking. Shortly after the CNAC was formed, an American set up a second competing airline, China Airways. The two merged in 1930, and in 1933, Pan Am, the American airline, bought the 45% share that had been China Airways. The CNAC would play an important role in Chinese aviation during the Second World War. So, the Japanese play an important part in this story because of their presence in China and the resulting tensions and fighting. So why were they there? Well, at the start of the First World War, China terminated the German leases of the enclaves in China. In September 1914, the Japanese captured the German enclave of Gaucho Bay and the port of Tsingtao. Now, the Treaty of Versailles did not return any of this territory to China, which angered the Chinese greatly. Now, then there's a number of incidents. The biggest one was in the north, where on 18 September 1931, a Japanese colonel and lieutenant colonel staged the Mukden incident, resulting in a short war with the northern Chinese factions. The Chinese were easily defeated, and the Japanese now controlled Manchuria. Thereafter, there were other small incidents and periods of tension that were subsequently reduced. Now, on July 7th, 1937, there was the Marco Polo Bridge incident outside Beijing, and it resulted in increased tensions, and finally, a full-scale Japanese invasion of the coastal cities and the capture of Beijing, Shanghai, and Nanking. Now, this became the full-scale war, and some people consider this the start of the Second World War. Turning to events in Canada, as I said, some of you may already be aware of Ray Crone's article, The Unknown Air Force, about the Kinghua Aviation School that operated in Saskatchewan from 1919 to early 1922. It also mentions the school that operated in Esquimalt, BC from 1922 to 23. So we'll start with these two schools and then cover the Chinese aviators in a broad sweep across Canada. So the Kinghua School was a creation of the Chinese National League, an organization that had branches in Chinese communities across Canada, and it supported the KMT, the party of Sun Yat-sen and later Chiang Kai-shek. The school was started in July 1919, and the first pilot that they had to go and provide the training was let go because of a low flying stunt where he literally flew almost at street level down downtown Saskatoon. The Chinese fired him because they weren't going to have something like this create a great deal of embarrassment to their cause. The next instructor was Harry Lobb, who did the real training in 1919, and flying operations shut down for the winter in November, but the ground training continued. And this would be the routine for the next 2 years. Springtime, summer, autumn flying, shut down in November. Now, the first pilot to solo was Lim Lee, who received the license in November 1919. I haven't figured out from whom he received the license. I think it's still too early for the Air Board. Now, the instructor for 1920 was C.R. McNeil, after Lobb was injured in the crash. McNeil had 8 students that year, in 1920, and he continued to train pilots until July 1921, when he left for a better paying job. The next instructor was Roland Groom, who also had 8 students, including several from the previous year. And one of the students was an actual general, Wu Hanyan from China, who went incognito while training. Now, at the start of 1922, the school was shut down. The exact reasons are unknown, but it could be cost, the lack of an instructor. A 1927 article stated that it was a lack of students and cost, but this was 5 years after the fact. Now, some of the Kinghua students did serve in China. In July 1921, Lim Lee was flying for the Canton Air Force, along with fellow Kinghua graduates, Wang and Yi Kun. At least 2 others have been noted, although their names were unfortunately not mentioned. Now, in terms of the number of trainees, the school is said to have trained 17 students, according to newspaper records. But my list of names suggests that the number of trainees may actually have been just a little higher. So, in 1919, 2 Chinese Canadians in Victoria, Chan Dun and Li Kuang-yi, began planning for an aviation school for Chinese Canadians. Some members of the Chinese Aviation Club had even taken airplane drives at that time. Now, in early 1922, they were able to organize a Chinese aviation school, also known as the Chinese Commercial Aviation School. In May 1922, the group indicated their purpose was to train pilots so that they could fly on commercial flying operations and train commercial pilots in China. The organization found a pilot in William Henry Brown from Victoria, who had served in the Royal Flying Corps and RAF with 84th Squadron, and he was awarded a military cross in June 1918, and was also a member of the Canadian Air Force in 1922, and was working for the Air Board at that time. Now, it should be noted that the newspapers are also indicating there was a school in Kamloops from 1920 to 21, but I haven't been able to find any further details on that. Now, as the organization was being set up, it bought a Curtiss JN4, registered GCACJ. It arrived on the 16th of May, was inspected by a member of the Air Board, and declared airworthy. The Jenny was equipped with HOPAR floats, as the school was actually going to operate from the harbor, Inskip Island at the entrance to Esquimalt Harbor. They even had a floating hangar for this purpose with a winch system to lift the airplane out of the water. Now, instruction started on 27th May with 8 students, and by early June, the students were flying under dual instruction. Now, the aircraft was actually used more than just instruction. In July, when there were large fires burning on the Saanich Peninsula north of Victoria, the pilot, Brown, or the instructor, I should say, did a reconnaissance for the government, and he even spotted a new fire. In September, the floats were removed from the Jenny and wheels substituted. The school was then moved to Saanich to conduct land-based operations in preparation for Air Board certification of any students who were ready, because the tests were going to be done from land and not from the water. Now, by that time, there were 2 students. Oh, sorry, there were 10 students. Li Zhou made the first solo flight on the 10th of October, but of course he would need more flying hours before he could take the Air Board exam. Unfortunately, he was injured while swinging a prop 2 days later. By early November, the Curtiss was back on pontoons, and the school was shut down in early December after more than 750 flights over that summer and autumn. The school started again on the 12th of January and had 2 more pupils solo almost right away, and then 2 more soloed on the 25th of January, 23. Unfortunately, operations ceased on the 24th of January when Hip Kwang, who soloed on the 20th of January, crashed into Esquimalt Harbor. He was rescued. The Jenny was recovered, but it was irreparable. And this ended the Esquimalt School. What happened to the students, particularly the 5 who soloed, is unknown. I haven't been able to find anything about them. And I'm sorry for not keeping up with the slides. There we go. Now, Before the Kinghua School opened, there was already a Chinese Canadian who was interested in aviation. In June 1919, restaurant owner Harry Chu of Paris, Ontario, bought a Jenny from Ericsson Limited of Toronto. Now, he had restaurants in Guelph, Gulf, and Paris, and wanted to use the airplane to visit the other restaurants more quickly. Now, he took some lessons from a gentleman named McCarthy, whom I haven't tracked down, who worked for Bishop Barker Airlines. Mr. Chu had made some flights on his own, but then crashed at Brantford. A mechanic from Bishop Barker examined the aircraft and declared it a write-off, but Mr. Chu and some friends partly repaired it. He then flew it to Armour Heights in Toronto and crashed again on landing. And the aircraft burned in a hangar fire not long thereafter. Now, his name won't be found on any list of Canadian aviators, as he was never licensed under the Air Board, which was created later. So Harry Chu was likely the first Chinese Canadian aviator. Now, another early Chinese Canadian aviation pioneer began her flying in Saskatoon when a friend suggested she go up on a flight with him in 1919. So this was the Kinghua School, and the friend was Lim Lee. Annie Lee of Edmonton then bought her own plane and continued lessons with Lim Lee until he crashed her plane. She then continued her lessons in Edmonton with George Gorman in 1920, with a gentleman named Mr. McLeod in 1922, and concluded it in 1923 with Wap May. Although it's unknown how much flying she actually did, she was described as being capable of simple aerobatics. And unfortunately, she died of an illness in October 1927. So throughout most of the 20s, we didn't have, or the last half of the 20s, we didn't have very much in the way of Chinese Canadian aviators. But in September 1930, James Chin of Montreal received his commercial license in the United States on September 23rd. Now, he was believed to be the first Chinese to do so in the US. And in January 31, he was reported to be off to Canton to train Chinese pilots. He may have gone, but he was again back in the US in 37, and again heading out with another Chinese pilot, but this time to fight the Japanese. I haven't been able to find any information about where he obtained his private pilot's license or what he did between 1931 and 37, or anything after he left for China the second time. Now, in July 1934, you had Benny Hum and Tom Yi Hu, who were taking flying instruction at the Montreal Flying School. They owned a laundry together on De Carey Boulevard and wanted to learn to fly. Now, language was a problem, but the two were enthusiastic and they were quite well liked by their fellow members. What became of their instruction is unknown. Interestingly, the Montreal school boasted that had the first two Chinese Canadians in Canada learning to fly, but as we know, this was incorrect. The next time we see something about Chinese Canadian aviators in Montreal was in 1936, and Stanley Kwan, George Num Wu, and George Lee, which is the anglicized version of their name, received their wings at that time. There is no word on what they wanted to do except maybe fly to China and teach pilots there. And again, what became of them is not known. Now, newspapers noted that this is the first time since 1930 that Canadian Chinese are holders of a flying license. Again, this was, of course, incorrect. What we've seen so far, other than Kinghua and the Esquimalt school, is that Chinese Canadians were interested in aviation for the joy of flying, and in one case, to train other Chinese. There's no military connection to these efforts, but that didn't mean that in the 1930s, especially the early 30s, there wasn't an effort to train Chinese Canadian aviators for service in China. Now, after the Kenghua and Esquimalt schools, it would be another 8 years before there would be any effort at creating another Chinese-Canadian aviation school. These efforts were in Calgary in 1931. However, they originated again with the Chinese National League. They wanted to organize a school similar to Kenghua, but they weren't able to do so. As it was, the Chinese students who were interested did fly with the Calgary Aero Club. There were at least 5 Chinese Canadians who gained their licenses with that school in the early 1930s. By mid-April 1932, Sam Ma had soloed. Zhou Ma, Eddie Ma, and Bing Fong were almost ready to solo, while Kateen Mars had just begun his dual training. Jock Palmer, manager of the Western Flying Service, also indicated that he had 4 other students in the education system. So we're talking about 9 students at one time flying in Calgary. Now, on the 4th of July, Sam Ma, Kateen Mars, and Zhou Ma received their pilot licenses. By September, they were ready to leave for China, where they had received offers to serve in the Chinese Air Force, as the newspapers called it. But I believe that what they're referring to is the Canton Air Force. In celebration of their licenses and the imminent departure, they flew a formation flight over Chinatown in Calgary. Now, they had originally wanted to get their commercial licenses, but then they received these offers. Now, I don't actually know when they departed for China. Others flying in September 1932 were Bing Fong, who had soloed, plus Harry Long or Henry Long. It varies depending on which article you're reading. There's also Dick Hillman, Eddie Ma, and Quan Yule, who were ready to solo. And the Chinese Canadians made up half of the students at the Western Flying Services. Now, not all of the trainees went to China. Bing Fong remained in Calgary and continued to fly. And he achieved his goal of receiving his commercial pilot's license since August 1933. And he wanted to continue to improve his skills before flying commercially in China. In Edmonton in June 32, so we're talking roughly the same period, Morris Burberger, the Edmonton and Northern Alberta Aero Club, he was instructing Guy Dan and Masui Sun, as well as hockey player Eddie Shore of the Boston Bruins, all at the same time. There was also 17-year-old Ma Lim from Lamont, Alberta, who started his training 1 month later in July. Now, in February 33, Ji Kwang was the 4th Chinese Canadian to train at that school. The first 3 were called upon to serve in the Chinese Air Force, but if they had their training paid for by the China National League or by some other organization, I don't know. Ji Dan received his license in July 32. Now, he was described as being middle-aged and owned a restaurant in Edmonton. The newspapers say he wanted to learn to fly so he could fight the Japanese. And in April 34, he was occupied learning about aero engines. It's likely he never made it to China, as this would have meant leaving family and restaurant behind. Masui Sun gained his license, and he had left by early 1933 to join the Canton Air Force. And he served with them and returned to Edmonton in November 1938. Hui Kwang from Vancouver was the son of a former member of the Canton legislature, and his father was also a colonel in the Canton 1st Division. Kwang also wanted to fight the Japanese. In 1934, he was flying regularly in Edmonton, and in May 1937, he was taking ground school instruction in Edmonton, but for what, it wasn't stated. He was still in Edmonton in October 37 and reported that he might leave for China fairly soon. Now, we don't know what happened to him afterwards. Now, in February 33, Lim, the 17-year-old, received his pilot's license. He stated that he wished to continue studying to obtain more qualifications, although in March, he stated that he wished to fly against the Japanese. By October 1937, he was Flight Sergeant Lim in China and flying in combat over Shanghai. And in November 1938, it was reported that he was either killed or captured by the Japanese. It was neither, but we'll get back to him later. Now, there's another school in Edmonton, and we had Frank Marr training at the Northwest Aero School, Marine School of Flying. In October 32, he was reported to be off to China with another Chinese-Canadian pilot who had trained in Winnipeg, Charles Wong. And they both planned on joining the Air Force. The two of them were feted at a dinner that included civilian pilots from the school, civilian pilots from the area, and even some Government of Canada pilots. It was also reported in 1937 that there were two other Chinese Canadians who had obtained their licenses in Canada and who were in China. They were supposed to have gained their licenses in Edmonton. They were Jean and Andrew Ma. But when they did their training and when they gained their licenses, I haven't been able to find yet. Now, Saskatoon had been home of the Kenghua School in the early 1920s. But there were also some Chinese who apparently took flying training for enjoyment. There were two Chinese Canadians who trained on their own at the Clearwater Aviation School in Shaunavon in 1922 and 23. So this is just after the Kenghua School had shut. These were Li Shun and Y.M. Lee. The two would even assemble their own aircraft in July 1924. Little is known about what Y.M. Lee did afterwards, and Li Shun owned a laundry in Saskatoon that he continued to operate, so I don't believe he ever departed. I think it was just flying for the sheer joy of flying. At least some Chinese in Saskatoon remained air-minded. When a new flying club was being formed in the city in November 1927, Ung Lee, who had been with Kenghua, offered them his Curtiss Jenny as a training aircraft. And in Moose Jaw, Jack Wong gained his license from the Moose Jaw Flying Club. He went to China in late 1937, but because of appeals from his mother and sister, he didn't enlist to fly against the Japanese, and instead he was home again by August 1938. However, the earlier effort appears to have trained most of the interested men and women in the area. So no further Chinese Canadian trainees are noted in Saskatchewan after 1937, except for one, Sun Quan, also known as Tony Wong. Now, Tony Wong gave up his engineering program at the University of Alberta to become a pilot. He started in Saskatoon in 1932, but after a crash in November 1933, he moved to Winnipeg, where he continued his flying training with the Winnipeg Flying Club. He received his wings there in 1935. Tony then went on to Missouri to study more about aviation, likely engineering, as he wrote and passed the Air Engineer exam and received his certificate in 1936. In December of that year, he planned on proceeding to China so he could join the China National Aviation Corporation. And in 1938, he was flying for them, along with a gentleman by the name of L.C. Lee, who trained at the Brandon Flying Club. Unfortunately, there's a paucity of information on what he did later. Now, the Winnipeg Flying Club had other Chinese Canadians earning their pilot's license with them. In May 32, it was Norman Lee and Jim Yee who were in training. Lee had started in roughly April 32. He received his pilot's wings in May 33. and participated in the Winnipeg Flying Club's aerial tour of Manitoba in 1933. We next hear of him heading to China in October 37 and returning in December. It would thus appear that this was a visit and not an effort to join either the CNAC or the Chinese Air Force. Jim Yi was in training definitely by May 32, and we know nothing about him at this time, nothing further. Charles Wong also trained in Winnipeg and is reported to have been the first Chinese Canadian to have received his pilot's license in Winnipeg. He was leaving for China in January 1933 to serve in the Air Force. Again, unfortunately, little is known about him. There's also mention of two Chinese Canadian pilots who were departing for China in February 38 to join the Air Force. Again, from Winnipeg. The newspapers don't mention their names, but it does note that the Chinese community had raised enough funds to send them over there. And interestingly enough, we've got Russell Kwong, Fred Ma, and Teddy Ma, who were taking ground training at the National School of Aviation, February 1932. Really, there's nothing to be said about the National School of Aviation. It looks like it was more of a ground training establishment, because I never did find whether or not they actually had any airplanes. Now, their hope was to serve with the Air Force in China, again, likely the Canton Air Force. And it also appears that they were undertaking the training at their own expense. Moving on to Vancouver. In the mid-1930s, there were at least 5 Chinese Canadians at the Aero Club of BC, located at Sea Island. They did both their training here and their practice flying. They're of interest because they represent the spectrum of reasons for flying, while 2 of them are also quite well known. There's also a military connection in all of this because their instructor was Flight Lieutenant A.H. Wilson, who was a member of Number 11 Army Cooperation Squadron, which was a part-time, non-permanent active Air Force squadron. Now, I found out a little about Harry Long. He might be the Harry Long who trained in Calgary in 1933. This one was training in Vancouver in 1933 and early 1934. And there's a little more available on him. Mon Lam began his flying training around July 1934. By August, he had soloed, and he kept flying on a very regular basis at the flying club, putting in a couple of hours each month. The last we see of him in the news is in January 1935. Mr. Lum was obviously flying for pleasure, doing so even when the conditions were less than optimal. And he appears to have stopped flying in early 1935. Yen Yip was much like Mon Lum. We don't yet know where he began his flying or with whom he trained, but he was flying solo as early as October 34, putting in again a couple of hours each month through to February 1935. And again, it would appear that he too was flying for pleasure. Otherwise, I would have expected both of them to have already headed off to China to either try to serve in the CNAC or the Canton Air Force. Now, a more famous person is Harold Chen, and he took his pilot training for a different reason. He wanted to fly against the Japanese. He began his training around the same time as Mon Lam, and he was still in Vancouver in September 1934. By March 35, he was flying for the Canton Air Force, and by January 1938, he was a major. I don't know when he started, but he was flying for the China National Aviation Corporation thereafter, and he was evacuating people out of Hong Kong during the Japanese invasion there, and later was flying over the hump, as the route through the Himalayas were known. And this was first from India, then from Burma, and he had over 10,000 flying hours by the time he finished. Now, Bill Laurie might also be a familiar name. He was the first Chinese-Canadian officer in the Royal Canadian Navy, and possibly the first officer of Chinese origin in any of His Majesty's Navy. In May 1943, he enlisted in the RCN, and in August 1945 was the first officer ashore at Hong Kong. Now, he began his training at roughly the same time as the others, but I don't know when he stopped. But eventually he did get a job with the Department of Transport as a radio officer in Winnipeg. Now, in Windsor, we have a number of other people receiving their training there. Gordon Hahn from Windsor, but trained in Hamilton, starting in 1927. The newspapers report that he was denied a license in Canada because of his ethnicity. He therefore left for China in September 1930. He left for Germany in September 1930 to get more training and receive his pilot's license. And he wanted to fly in civil aviation in China. Following in Hahn's footsteps were Jimmy Hong and Li An, who also trained in Hamilton. And in October 1931, they too were in Germany. They and Gordon Hong were told at that time to hold themselves in readiness to join the Canton Air Force if there was a war with Japan. Now, it looks therefore like they had actually received either support from the community or the China National League to do their flying training. In October 31, there were two more Chinese Canadian youths. One of them, Yi Chan, and the other was Sen Li, and they were off to Sudbury to learn to fly there. At the same time, Hung Hwa Sung went to Toronto for his lessons. And as I said, it looks like all of this was supported either through the China National League or the local Chinese community. We also have Lim Lee, who was born in China and came to Canada to work in his father's restaurant. He began his flying training in December 1937 with the London Flying Club. The reason for his training was that he wanted to return to China and to train pilots to fly against the Japanese. As with so many of the others, not much else is known about him or his later flying career, if there was one. And there was one Chinese-Canadian aviator east of Quebec who I've been able to identify, and that was Yi Tang. And he was a restaurant owner who took his flying lessons at Cape Breton Flying Club, and he qualified in February 1939. Now, the newspaper article stated that he was the only Chinese-Canadian pilot in Eastern Canada, but I haven't been able to verify that. Now, earlier I had mentioned Ma Lim, who is also known as Ma Kwak Lim, or Kwo Lim Ma. He got his license in Edmonton in 1933. And of all the pilots, he's the only one for whom I've been able to find anything in terms of combat flying. He's known to have served with the 17th and 29th Pursuit Squadron. He is credited with two Japanese aircraft, the first being on the 20th of February 1939, when he was deputy commander of the 17th Squadron. In April, he was the commander of the 29th Squadron, flying the Polikarpov I-15 Bis. Later that month, the squadron operated in support of ground troops near Nanchang. And on the 29th of April, he was attacked by Japanese aircraft when he was out to go and shoot down some of their bombers. He managed to avoid getting shot down, continued his attack, and shot down a Nakajima Ki-27. In 1942, he joined the CNAC, but was killed on the 1st of September 1944 when his aircraft failed to clear a cliff on taking off from Kunming. Now, the Wong brothers was Robert and Thomas. They're born in Nanaimo in 1919 and 1922, respectively. They grew up in Vancouver and began building a Pete and Paul Sky Scout kit plane in a room in their house. By 1936, it had outgrown the space, and they needed to find a larger area in which to assemble it. And they found that at Boeing's Vancouver plant. The employees there provided them advice on attaching wings, elevators, the tail to the fuselage, and also let them use their large sewing machines. They were even given an engine from a scrapyard, while a local mechanic overhauled it for them. Now, Robert got a flying license in 1940 in the US, and he became a BCATP instructor. Tommy enlisted in the RCAF in November 42 and served as a pilot. Now, reports indicate that he already had 200 flying hours, but not where he obtained his license. And as I mentioned at the start, after the war, they operated Central Airways from Toronto's Island Airport, which was a flying school and a charter airline. There's also the Ma brothers, Albert and Cedric, who were born in Prince Rupert in 1920 and 22. Now, from an early age, they were interested in flying. They were sent to Los Angeles to take their flying lessons. Albert was rejected for RCF service, but a referral was made on his behalf, and he received a letter from Wilfred Wap May offering him a job at No. 2 Air Observer School in Edmonton. May, of course, was the manager of the school. Ma accepted, and in 1942, he left No. 2 and transferred to No. 8 Air Observer School just outside Quebec City. He took a leave of absence in 43 to go to China to check on his mother and sister there. And he ended up flying to the CNAC from July 1943 to November 44. And then later with his own airline to help the Chinese nationalists against the communists after the war. Cedric also ended up flying for Wap May and would join his brother at the CNAC, serving with that airline from May 44 to May 46. And Cedric would join his brother in supporting the nationalists after the war. They became quite respected Bush pilots, and Albert was even an instructor in Montreal after the war. So, from this brief, literally overview, we can see that there were Chinese Canadians across Canada who were interested in aviation. There were at least 69 who took flying training in the 1919 to 39 period, most trained in Canada. How many obtained their pilot's license, a Canadian one that is, remains to be determined. They had many reasons for taking the training. It was personal enjoyment, to train or serve in the Canton or Chinese Air Force, or to fly for Chinese civil aviation. The desire to fight the Japanese was at times not appropriate because there were periods when there was no fighting with the Japanese. So I think this was a desire on the part of some of these trainees to be ready to fly against the Japanese if there was any further fighting. Now, funding for many of the students came from the China National League and their own Chinese community. But with this was the expectation that they would fly in the Canton Air Force or later the Chinese Air Force. For some periods, I think the expectation was that they wouldn't be flying against the Japanese, but against other Chinese warlords. Overall, how many such pilots there were, I can't say with certainty, as we know of many who received such support, but not everyone. And then there were those who funded their own way through training simply for the love of flying. Now, the one thing that can be observed is that with the exception of Tommy Wong, none of them joined the RCAF. although there were at least 60 Chinese Canadians who did so, plus at least another dozen in RAF Ferry Command during the Second World War. One thing that struck me was there also appears to have been little in the way of racism in the aviation training community in Canada. Although getting any trainees during the Depression would have been a plus, so it would hardly have been in the school's best interest to go and turn anybody away. I mean, and if you look at the support that the Wangs received in Vancouver, you wonder if the aviation community was willing to support anybody who was interested in aviation, you know, no matter what their skin color. Thank you. And I'll be taking any questions now.
Well, I'll just say before we start with questions, thank you very much, Matt, for another great presentation. I do love that you have that knack for discovering or for like shining a light on those lesser known topics. It's not just, you know, the same old to Spitfire, not to disparage Spitfires, but it's something new, it's something interesting. So thank you for that.
My pleasure. But yeah, eventually this is going to become a CAHS journal article in a slightly different format. I think I'm going to do it chronologically, because the one thing I noticed is you had early 20s and then early 30s up to say 35, and then a few scattered in the late 20s and late 30s. And I think overall, this is one of those, this is an interesting topic. It's never, from what I can tell, been written up anywhere. And it'll take a little more research, because I'd like to know what happened to some of these people. You know, what were their backgrounds? Did they come back to Canada after flying overseas or not? And I think that's an area that still I need to do more investigation on. But this is, you know, basically an overview of what I found so far, and it raises a whole pile of questions. I think it's interesting, to say the least.
Have you looked into this famous CHS document, the first 500?
My copy is missing somewhere, but my copy is missing in action. So I haven't been able to look at it.
Interesting. At a glance, I don't see in the first Canadians 500 licensed civil pilots, I don't see any Chinese names, which is quite interesting.
Yeah,
this goes up well into the 20s.
Yeah, and that's what I had remembered from it. I couldn't remember seeing any Chinese Canadian names in that list when I last saw my book about 3 years ago.
You mentioned that one pilot was possibly denied a license because of his ethnicity, and I wonder if there might have been a problem there, you know, in Ottawa.
Yeah, it's hard to say. I mean, until we can track down more of these, and unfortunately, visiting the library and archives in the last number of weeks has been problematic. So I haven't been able to go and explore any of the files there to see who had obtained their licenses.
Matt, hi. I don't have a camera, unfortunately. You discount racism, but I guess the question is, what was the Chinese Canadian population during this point in time? And is there perhaps implicit racism in the fact that just so few were taking flying training? And I'm surprised that only one made it through to the RCAF. You've already mentioned that they were excluded from other professions. Is that perhaps an indication that that there were other forces at work?
Well, to answer some parts of your question, the Chinese population in 1931 in Canada, it was, if I remember correctly, it was roughly about 42,000. But the problem with that figure is that when you look at the population curve, most of these were older gentlemen. I mean, there were only, out of that, 42,000, there's only like about 3,000 Chinese women. So the actual number of young men available would have been fairly small out of that 42,000. I haven't gotten into the demographics yet. As for getting into the RCAF during that period, the problem here is that I don't think, from what I can tell, any of these gentlemen had a university degree. And to get into the RCAF during the interwar period, you had to have a university degree, and you had to have been admitted into the Canadian Officer Training Corps in order to get into the RCAF. So you went to university, were a member of the COTC, and then in the summer, you did your flying training. So without a university degree and without being accepted into the COTC, it would have been, well, impossible for any of them to join. It's only with the Second World War that you see the regulations loosening. Blacks were actually able to enlist despite the regulations. I've got the names of 60 of them, of whom 13 were able to enlist before the color barrier was listed. Unfortunately, for the Japanese and Chinese Canadians, there was not a single one who was able to enlist in the RCAF before the color barrier was lifted in March 42. So it wasn't so much a question of racism that they couldn't get into the RCAF in the interwar period. It certainly was from 39 up to March 42. I think I got all of your questions, I hope.
Okay, thank you. Yes.
Matt, do you have any thoughts on if you were to get past those, say, Toronto paywalls for the newspaper articles, do you think you would have found a few other Chinese Canadian pilots?
I found hints that there were some flying there. As I said, there was one from Windsor who went up to Toronto. I just might break down and stop being a cheapskate and go and get a subscription to the Toronto Star Online archives. But I think we would probably find, my guess would say, about another 5 to maybe 10 names there. So, because Toronto did have a good sized Chinese population in the 1930s.
Hi, could I introduce myself? Yeah. Can you hear me?
Oh, yes.
Yes.
Oh, okay, thank you. Yeah, well, thank you so much. I've joined you. You can tell I'm not a member of the CAHS, but my sister, Roberta Wong, is a new member. I'm Evelyn Wong, and my sister, Roberta, and I are the daughters of Robert Wong that you mentioned, who, with Robert and Tommy, they built the Technical Sky Scout in Vancouver, and then started the flying school in Toronto. So I thank you so much for this really wonderful research and insights into Chinese Canadian pilots and Chinese Canadians who love to fly that we weren't aware of. We have been looking at the story of our fathers, right? And it was Larry Milbury who has been working with us on a submission for our fathers. But he had suggested to my sister that, you were doing this presentation today. So she couldn't join you, Roberta Lau, but I'm very glad that I was able to. So if I could just share just 3 points that you were mentioning. One, definitely, I think about Chinese Canadians during the interwar period. The head tax was one attempted deterrent, but the Chinese kept coming for a better life in Canada. So they would raise the funds even when the head tax was 500. So in 1923, the government stopped the head tax, but they introduced the Exclusion Act. So from 1923 to 1947, no Chinese were allowed into Canada from China. So that really, and then in those early periods, it was extremely difficult to bring the wives over. But my grandfather, fortunately, was one who was able to. So my father was one of 12 children, and Uncle Tommy, but they were two of 12 children. But there were very few, as you said, Mathias, very few Chinese Canadian families during that period, very few. So there would be very few young Chinese, male or female, in that period. And the number of women, of course, was almost nothing compared to the number of Chinese men who came to work, and they were laborers, low paid laborers, or they were merchants in the Chinatown to serve the community and the non-residents who like to come to Chinatowns around for tourism and Chinese restaurants and all. The second is in terms of serving in the war, RCAF. Well, I should say contextually, 1935, when my dad and Uncle Tommy built the airplane, my dad was 17 years old and my Uncle Tommy was 14. So they were, I guess, maybe much younger than all these others that you were mentioning who wanted to fight for the Japanese. I think they just had a love for the airplane. Like they started with building model airplanes. But my dad had just finished a degree from Parts Air College, in a Bachelor of Maintenance Engineering in 1940. And he was then called to serve as a flight engineer and test pilot. It was the number 7 EFTS, right? The Elementary Flight Training School. That was the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan to train pilots for the RCAF. So he was not directly in the RCAF, but he was helping to train, and he was a flight engineer. And then my Uncle Tommy, he trained, I've got it here, he trained with, is it number 6, you will all know this, number 6 Initial Training School in Toronto. So he joined in 1940, but he served in the RCF in Trois-Rivières, but it was only in 1944 that he became a warrant officer and a flight instructor in Nova Scotia. So my understanding was it wasn't until around 1944, by then so many Chinese Canadians had been so supportive with the war effort, and the Chinese communities were raising funds to support the war effort. And the number of men, mostly men, people they had serving in the war, Canadians, was getting to be a challenge by 1944. So they were bringing in the Chinese as well, because they were so supportive of the war effort. This is my understanding. And the last one, I think the question about building, how some Chinese had the aircraft. When my dad was 17, he came across a magazine article. And so the Piatenpo, right? Air Camper and Sky Scout. So this Bernard Piatenpo had been designing and putting out home builds precisely that would be very affordable for anyone, anyone to build. It was easy to get materials. You use a used model, a Ford model engine. So my dad actually and Uncle Tommy found the Ford model engine in a junkyard for $25. So it was very affordable. And so I guess that's why when he saw the article, he thought, I can do this, because he couldn't pay for a lot of lessons. He wouldn't ever be able to be in commercial airplanes and all, but if he could build his own, he then could fly it, and it was very cheap to fly. And he was able to fly 100 hours before and he got his pilot's license before 1940. He got it around 1937, before he went to Parts Air College. So that's just a bit, but anyway, it's wonderful to meet you, Mathias, and I think we could share with you more photos. And our cousin, Arlene Chan, is a Chinese Canadian historian. And I'm sure you'd love to connect with her on more on the background, but we have I don't think she has, and we don't have any of this information about all these Chinese Canadian pilots. It's just so exciting. Thank you. And I look forward to your article.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Yeah.
I didn't put it in, but I remember reading one of them after the war. I can't remember whether it was one of the Wong brothers or one of the Ma brothers, was saying that in the 1930s, nobody would have accepted a Chinese Canadian bush pilot or even pilot. And yet it seems to have swung completely the other way then after the war. So if there's that much rejection in the aviation world in that sense, you can see why they were turning to China for to be able to practice commercial flying or even becoming combat pilots. Because they certainly couldn't have done it here.
It wasn't just aviation. In the 1930s, no Chinese could get work outside of the Chinese community. They would get no work, basically, unless that's why there's so many entrepreneurs. And for employing professionals, the Chinese Canadians were not employed until after basically the 1950s. And even then, I think it was quite a struggle to open it up. I have cousins who couldn't get teaching jobs because they were Chinese. And this is in the 50s and 60s. It was still a tough integration after the Exclusion Act. And, you know, after the war effort showed that Chinese Canadians were very Canadian. Yeah. So there were no employment opportunities. My father and uncle never imagined they never expected to get work. But on the your comment about it seemed to be a little discrimination in the aviation industry, I think that's what we found so encouraging. The aviation community were so supportive of my father. It was Boeing aircraft that stepped up and offered them space in the Boeing factory in Cole Harbor to assemble the plane. And the supervisor gave them advice. They gave them the machines, as you mentioned, to sew the fabric, which my grandmother and aunt helped, and my grandmother's friends helped to sew the fabric. But the Boeing factory were very, all the technical people in Vancouver. I think, as you said, it's because here was a 17-year-old, right? 18, 19-year-old, so enthusiastic and so deeply knowledgeable, because he just loved, he learned. I mean, when I see the plans of the Pietenpol, I'm amazed at a 17-year-old when he saw it, imagine he could do it, you know, because he had no engineering background. He was a high school student. He was in second year, he was going into third year high school when he started building the plane in their parents' home. So he got help from the community. Thanks.
I see Jim's question about what happened to the Pietenpol. It eventually was sold to somebody else near the start of the Second World War. And that gentleman, if I remember correctly, owned it during the war, but eventually it was written off. I can't remember the exact story now, but that's what I can remember reading.
You mean for my dad, for CFBAA? Yeah. For my dad's plane, yeah, it had 4 owners, 3 in British Columbia, and the last was in Saskatoon. So there is a really concerted effort to try to find it. Yeah, it would be amazing. Yeah, but the last owner was registered. I think it was 1946. I have it here somewhere. By a family and a fellow in Saskatoon.